Lennox Hargrove didn't bother looking up from the revenue report when his assistant announced the new hire. He was 2 pages into a Q3 breakdown that put Hargrove Hospitality's Vancouver flagship at 4.2% below projection. A number small enough to dismiss and large enough to keep him awake. His corner office on the 38th floor of Hargrove Tower had a view of English Bay that people in his industry flew across the country to photograph, and he never looked at it. "She's here," his assistant said from the doorway. "Send her in." The woman who walked in was around 30, maybe 32, calm-faced. She wore a charcoal blazer that wasn't expensive but looked considered, chosen deliberately rather than assembled to impress. She stopped 3 steps from the desk without advancing further. Not timidity. 3 steps was close enough to be present and far enough to hold her own ground. Lennox finally looked up. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "This role needs someone who can manage 3 properties at once, without checking in with me every 2 days. She didn't flinch. "Then I'm exactly what you need," I managed for. Not "I think I can handle it." Not "I'll do my very best." Just a correction delivered without warmth and without performance. Lennox held her gaze a half-second longer than he meant to. Then he returned to the page. "Monday, 8 o'clock, don't be late." She nodded once and left. What Lennox Hargrove didn't know, what he had spent 32 years constructing a careful life around never having to know, was that the woman who had just walked out of his office was the daughter he had refused to acknowledge before she was even born. The child he had publicly denied. The life he had chosen not to see. Her name was Blythe Renard. But the name on her birth certificate, the one her mother had never changed, the one that had simply waited, was Blythe Hargrove. Renard was her grandfather's surname. A man from a small town outside Calgary who had driven 6 hours in February when his daughter called him from a payphone, who had loaded her belongings into a borrowed truck without complaint, who had sat across the kitchen table and said, "We'll figure it out," in a voice that made it sound like certainty rather than hope. He was the one who stayed, so Blythe took his name. 8 months before that Monday morning, Blythe had been sitting in the kitchen of her Calgary apartment at 11 at night, a coffee going cold beside her laptop. Her mother, Odette Renard, who had spent 30 years building a catering business from a single commercial kitchen and a reputation for never missing a deadline, walked in from the grocery run and stopped when she saw the screen. The Hargrove Hospitality Group career portal, Senior Operations Manager, Western Region. Blythe. It closes in 4 days. Odette set the bags down slowly. The sound of cans settling was the only noise in the apartment for several seconds. "No. Mom, listen to me. I've been listening to you for 32 years. This is the one thing I've asked you to leave alone." Blythe turned in her chair. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I have no interest in revenge. I'm doing it because I have been the best operations manager in every room I've walked into for 8 years, and I want to work at the level where my skills actually belong. Hargrove Group is that level." "He is that level," Odette said. "He's the owner, he's not the reason." Odette sat down across from her. Her face was the same face it had always been in hard conversations, composed on the surface, something older moving underneath it. "He told his lawyers I fabricated the relationship. He told his business partners I was after his name. He was 26 years old, he had just signed his first major investment deal, and the moment he found out I was pregnant, he turned me into something ugly so he could keep something clean." She stopped. Her hands were flat on the table. "I built everything I have from zero after that. Not despite what he did, starting from zero, literally, because of it. And you're asking me to watch you walk into his building." "I'm asking you to trust me," Blythe said, "not him, not what happens, me." Odette didn't answer that night. She didn't answer the following morning either. But 3 days later, when Blythe sat down at the laptop, her mother didn't try to stop her. The hiring panel kept Blythe for 55 minutes. The standard process was 25. She had pulled Hargrove Group's operational data from public filings and cross-referenced it against hospitality industry benchmarks going back 6 years. She had identified 2 consistent inefficiencies in the group's food and beverage integration model, and 1 measurable gap in their staff retention pipeline that she estimated was costing close to $300,000 annually in training overhead. She laid it out without being asked and without softening it. The panel called her 2 weeks later. When the offer came through, she sat with it for 2 days before accepting. She called her grandfather, 81 now, still driving himself to the hardware store every Saturday, and told him she was moving to Vancouver. "You sure?" he said. "No," she said, "but I'm going anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "That sounds about right." For the first 2 weeks at Hargrove Group, Lennox didn't think about Blythe specifically. She appeared in his peripheral awareness the way genuinely capable people do, noticeable mainly through the absence of problems. Reports came in clean. Staff issues she'd inherited from the previous manager resolved without being escalated to him. A vendor dispute at the Kitsilano property that had been dragging for 2 months closed inside a week. His assistant mentioned her name 3 times in 10 days without Lennox asking. On the 16th day, he attended a standing operations review for the downtown flagship. Standard session, department heads, numbers, the familiar grind through occupancy rates and F&B margins. Blythe was presenting her first full property assessment. She didn't start with the numbers. She started with a walkthrough she'd done at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday 2 weeks prior, and a specific moment. A guest had stood at the front desk for 4 minutes, while 2 staff members worked 20 feet away with their backs turned. Not because they were negligent, but because the sight line from their station didn't cover the entrance from that angle. The problem isn't the staff, she said. It's the desk placement. Rotate it 11 degrees north and you eliminate the blind spot entirely. The cost is under $400. She moved through the rest of the assessment at the same pace. Concrete, sourced, without filler. Lennox watched her from the far end of the table. She didn't look to him for approval when she spoke. She spoke to the room. When someone pushed back on a recommendation, she listened fully before responding. Not with the managed patience of someone handling a difficult colleague, but with the genuine stillness of someone who had already considered the objection, and was deciding how much of her reasoning to share. After the room cleared, Lennox stayed. How long have you been in operations? 8 years, she said, gathering her folder. Where before this? Edmonton. 2 properties, then a regional consulting role covering Alberta and Saskatchewan. He nodded. She didn't wait for more, she left. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The not waiting. Not for praise, not for permission, not for the small cues that tell most people in a room exactly where they stand. She operated at her own internal pace, and the room either caught up or it didn't. He knew that quality. He had never cataloged it in himself, but he recognized it the way you recognize something you grew up hearing. By the shape rather than the sound. He didn't examine the feeling. He buried it under the afternoon schedule and kept moving, but it was there. Odette saw the photograph on a Wednesday. It was a brief item in a Vancouver business publication, something about Hargrove Group's sustainability certification launch. The photo was incidental. Lennox at a podium and just behind him, to the left, Blythe, standing the way she always stood when she was paying close attention. Weight slightly forward, arms loose, watching the room rather than the speaker. Odette stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the browser and called her sister in Lethbridge. She looks like him, she said when her sister picked up. A pause. Odette. She's always looked like him. I've spent 30 years telling myself that people only see what they're looking for. But she's standing right behind him in a photograph, and the line of her jaw. She stopped. Her voice didn't break, but it was very close. If I can see it from here, Suzanne, does Blythe know what she's actually walking into? She thinks she does, Odette said before her sister could answer. She's 32 years old and she's the most capable person I've ever raised, and she has no idea how much this could cost her if it comes apart. 3 floors below the executive suite, Blythe was learning things the interview had never prepared her for. She had studied Lennox Hargrove from the outside for years. The profile was consistent. A man who built his empire through precision and a particular kind of ruthlessness that never looked ruthless. It looked like standards. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Rooms arranged themselves around his expectations before he stated them. But she had also seen what the profile didn't include. She had come back one evening for a binder she'd left in the conference room. The hallway past Lennox's office was quiet, his door slightly open. He was at his desk but not working. There was something in his hands, not a phone, not a document, something small. He was looking out at the water, at the city going dark below him, and whatever he was holding, he was just holding it. Not studying it, just holding. He put it in his drawer the moment he heard her footsteps in the hall. I forgot something in the conference room, she said from the doorway. Go ahead, he said, already back to his screen. She found the binder and left, but she thought about it for 3 days after. The man who had told a lawyer she was fabricating a relationship, who had let his partners call her name something disposable, who had never once in 32 years tried to find out whether the child was real. That man sat alone at dusk holding something he didn't want anyone to see him holding. That didn't redeem him. She was clear-eyed about that. The things he had done to Odette were not errors of judgment, or the careless mistakes of a young man under pressure. They were decisions made deliberately, from a position of power and with full understanding of the cost to someone else. There was no version of it that cleaned up into something forgivable. But it complicated the portrait she had lived with. A straightforward villain was useful. A villain kept the anger clean, and anger was a clean emotion. It didn't ask anything of you except to keep feeling it. What was sitting in front of her now was different. This was a man who had made a terrible decision 32 years ago and had never, apparently, managed to fully outrun it. A man who carried something privately that he would never mention aloud. She didn't know what to do with that yet. The dish came to her on a Thursday evening. Odette had mentioned it only once, years ago, not as a romantic story. She didn't tell romantic stories about that time, but as a passing detail while explaining why she'd stopped making a certain recipe. A mushroom and brie tart, old French-Canadian style, the kind you'd find in a kitchen in rural Quebec. Lennox had made it for her at a rented apartment in East Vancouver. He'd spent 40 minutes on it and burned the first batch and started over without saying anything about it. She had sat on the counter and watched him. That was the night she'd thought, this might be something real. She never made it again. Blythe made it. She was building a legitimate proposal for an update to the group's private event catering line, real work, grounded in menu research and margin analysis, something she'd been developing for 3 weeks. And tucked into the tasting menu at the back, beside a note that simply read regional heritage recipes, modern presentation, was the mushroom and brie tart. Plated simply, sourced correctly, unmistakable, to anyone who had once spent 40 minutes on it in a small apartment kitchen, burning the first batch. The presentation happened in Lennox's boardroom. He had been half present for the first portion of it, the way he was sometimes half present when a meeting didn't require direct input. Then the tasting plates came around. He reached the tart, he looked at it, he picked up the small card beside it. Something changed in his face. Not dramatically, not the way faces change in the telling of stories, sudden and readable. It was a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. A pause that had nothing to do with the meeting. He looked up. Blythe was watching him. Not performing anything. Watching the way she always watched, level, patient, already knowing what would happen next. The meeting ended. The room cleared. Blythe stayed where she was, standing beside the table, and when the last person had gone she reached back and closed the door without being asked. Lennox sat without moving. How, he said. It wasn't quite a question, it was the only word that had made it out intact. My mother told me about it once, Blythe said. She said she never made it again. The room held the weight of what was in it. Lennox stood slowly. The movement of a man whose legs have gone uncertain underneath him. He crossed to the wide, north-facing window and stood looking out at the water. When he turned back, his face was open in the way things become open when the energy required to keep them closed finally exceeds the fear of what's inside. Odette, he said. Yes. He exhaled. I told myself she had come to me with a plan. That she had calculated something and was willing to do whatever it took to execute it. He paused. I was 26 years old. I had just secured the capital that was going to determine the next decade of my life, and I chose to believe something that made her the problem instead of me. Blythe watched him without looking away. Was it easier? He turned. What? Believing she was calculating. Was it easier than the alternative? The question wasn't cruel, it was exact. The same precision she brought to every room now applied to this one. Yes, he said, it was a great deal easier. Good, Blythe said quietly. Then you already know what you did. There was no raised voice in that boardroom. No accusations assembled for maximum impact. Just two people in a glass room above English Bay, and the long, quiet aftermath of a decision made 32 years ago that had never fully stopped moving through both of their lives. Lennox took one step toward her. She didn't move back. I didn't come here to make you pay for anything, she said. Her voice was steady and matter-of-fact. I came because I needed to understand what kind of man you actually are. Not the version I'd built from the outside over 30 years. The actual one. And he said. His voice was careful in a way she had never heard from him in any meeting. She took her time. You're harder to dismiss than I needed you to be. That's not a compliment, but it's the truth. Odette arrived in Vancouver 4 days later. She hadn't told Blythe she was coming. She had bought the ticket on a Tuesday night, sat looking at the confirmation screen for 15 minutes, and then closed her laptop and started packing. They met in the cafe off the hotel lobby. 2 cups of tea between them that neither touched for the first several minutes. He knows, Blythe said. I know he knows. Odette wrapped both hands around her cup. You put that tart on the menu. You told me the story once. Once. Odette was quiet. I knew when you first mentioned the Vancouver position that you would find some version of that door eventually. Are you angry with me? Her mother looked at her for a long moment. I was frightened. There's a difference. She set the cup down. I spent 30 years carrying what he did as though it were mine to carry. as though his decision to throw my name away was a verdict on me rather than on him. She stopped. I don't want that for you. It isn't the same situation, Blythe said. I know it isn't. You walked in on your own terms. I didn't have any terms. Odette looked at her hands on the table. That matters. They sat with that for a while. Did he ask about me? Odette said finally. Blythe paused. He said your name, just said it. Like he'd been holding on to it somewhere he didn't look at. Odette didn't speak for a long time after that. Lennox didn't make declarations. That was the part of what followed that mattered most, because declarations would have been for him, a way to narrate his own change rather than actually make it, and he was beginning to understand, slowly and without comfort, that he had no standing to ask for anything at all. He called Blythe 2 weeks later, not about work. He said he didn't know how to do this, and he wanted her to know that, and he wasn't calling to ask her to make it easier for him. She was quiet for a moment. That's the most honest thing you've said to me, she said. He wrote to Odette, a letter, handwritten, which surprised him when he realized he'd picked up a pen. He didn't write it to produce absolution. He wrote it to say, I know what I cost you. I cannot give it back. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to believe that I know what I did, and that I have known for a long time. Odette read it at the kitchen table in Calgary. She read it twice. Then she put it in the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered. She didn't write back, not yet. But she stopped carrying it the way she had been carrying it for 3 decades, pressed flat against something private in her chest, heavy and unacknowledged, as if the act of putting it down would mean he had won something. She set it outside of herself, not for him, for the weight of it, for the space that opened when she stopped. That was its own kind of freedom. 3 months later, Blythe arrived at Hargrove Tower early for a meeting that had nothing to do with their personal history. Her position was confirmed, competitive, fully above board, something she had earned in rooms where Lennox wasn't present, with colleagues who knew nothing about either of them, and that nobody in the organization would have found a reason to question even if they had known. Lennox was at his desk when she appeared in the doorway. You're early, he said. I know. She set her bag down and took the chair directly across the desk, not beside it, not at an angle, across. She opened her laptop, the same room, the same desk, but different by everything that had moved through it. Lennox looked at her across the space between them. Something passed through his expression. Not peace, not relief, something older and more precise than either. The expression of a person who has been given something they stopped believing they deserved, and who is clear-eyed enough to know that receiving it is not the same as having earned it. I'm not here because you're my father, Blythe said without looking up from her screen. I want you to understand that. I do, he said. I'm here because you're trying. She looked up then, steady, direct, don't stop. She returned to her work. He returned to his document. For a while, the only sound in the office was the quiet of the city below, and the careful, unhurried work of 2 people beginning, slowly, to figure out what beginning actually means. He hadn't gotten his daughter back. That wasn't what this was, and he knew it. What he had been given was harder than that and more honest. The chance to become someone she didn't need to forgive, because forgiveness would have asked too much of her and she had already given enough. What she offered instead was a door left open. One she could close at any point, for any reason, without owing him an explanation. He understood that. And for the first time in 32 years, he didn't look away from it. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and let us know what it brought up for you. Subscribe to Brave Soul Stories TV. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you for being here.